And now I would like to turn the floor to Ellinor Morack. Ellinor Morack studied at Freie Universität in Berlin and at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And she received her master's and PhD degrees from Freie Universität. A revised version of her thesis has recently been published by Bamberg University Press. The title of the book is The Dowry of the State, The Politics of Abandoned Property and the Population Exchange in Turkey, 1921-1945. Her field of interests cover late Ottoman and early Republican history with special focus on state-society relations, the history of emotions, questions of governance, the establishment of capitalist property rights, and the local mechanics of nation building. She is currently starting a new project of non-nationalism and emotions in the works of Namık Kemal, and now she works as a lecturer and researcher at the University of Bamberg. Ellinor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ben önce Hrant Dink Vakfı'na beni davet ettiği için çok teşekkür ederim.
I would like to thank Hrant Dink Foundation for their invitation. At the same time, I will be delivering my speech in Turkish while preparing this presentation. My friend Yektan was very helpful, so I would like to thank to my friend. I was asked to speak slowly, and please, somebody warn me if I start speaking fast. My presentation, as you see, is focusing on the post-1922 period of Izmir. In the existing historiography, this Turkification used almost synonymously as enrichment. We do it. But this usage, as we see in the nationalists of that period, prevents us to see the real problem, because this economical Turkification is not enrichment, it is right the contrary. Because the post-war situation of Izmir is a good example to that. In the first years of the Republic, we know some problems, but they were dealt with separately. This profound economic inactivity, capital inequal, lack of capital, this chronic poverty, the backwarding in production, famine, the unemployment, etc. These needs to be taken as a phenomenon, not all together. There are many historians working on that, like Kemal Arı, Tülay Baran, Çağlar Keyder, Murat Koraltürk, and Erkan Sence. This is not the case only in Turkey. Turkification is actually an impoverishment process. This first caused by the structural reasons, and the second is in relation to the labor class. This labor class was non-Muslim in the past, but due to the war and massacres and population exchanges were replaced by the Muslims, and interestingly, some tensions between classes gained a new form. And national economy actually did not Turkify the richness, but poverty.
So in the early Republic period, we see strikes and general sadness, and these were the indications of a new class struggle. And today I have limited time, therefore I will give only a few examples. But in this short presentation, I will try to explain why we should look into Turkification concept from impoverishment perspective, and how this can create new horizons in our prism for perspective to the period and economic policy. And this presentation will not discuss in deep depth the economic, political, and social crisis in the first years of the Republic. I will mostly talk about problems that were discussed widely by the journalists of the period. These are the bread prices and the cause of the bread prices and low salaries and new Muslim poors, which were called Harikzede. And I will also look at the problems in the agricultural industry. And my sources constitute articles published in the newspapers and also the consulate reports of the United Kingdom and the US. Just right after the war, the situation of the city and the country triggered strikes. And the first strike we know of happened in the summer of 1923. This was a strike of pig packers. So I would like to show this nice picture to you. Of course, this picture was taken before the war. So these workers packed pigs, you see. Many women are among these workers. And the strike was suppressed very rapidly, but the packers achieved taking 22% raise for these salaries. This is found in the British Consul reports. And the workers of the İzmir Aydın Company went to strike on the 31st of August in the same year, but the strike lasted for 9 days, but it delayed bringing pigs to İzmir, and it gave a large damage to the pig industry and trade. The workers were represented by the nationalists who were pursuing national economy targets. The workers wanted race and job security, and they were after social economic issues. So the strikes did not only influence İzmir, they were also affecting other cities. For instance, printers and butchers of Istanbul started a strike in September in the same year. So this is the report from the US Consul. And all these actions can be described as reactions against the İzmir Economic Congress. In this Economic Congress, Mustafa Kemal Pasha and his comrades announced a corporatist perspective which ignored class conflict, and this approach, this perspective did not take into account the problems of the lower classes and their demands. So who were behind these strikes? And in order to answer this question, first of all, we have to look at the worker class in the late Ottoman period. Çağlar Keder has a book, State and Class in Turkey, and in this book he gives us information on the lumpen proletariat in İzmir, which existed in the late Ottoman period. These people who didn't have property and land was a large group in İzmir, but mostly they were citizens of Greece and other neighboring countries. And Rifat Bali published a report. This report belongs to 1921, and this report gives us an idea under which conditions these people were working and their remuneration. So houses were dark, humid, and the families were crowded, and the children children mortality was quite high, and tuberculosis was a major cause of death. And the poorest one were the women and children who were working at the tobacco plants. Unfortunately, this picture is from Istanbul, but I think that there were also similar plants in İzmir as well. As known, women and girls working outside the house were still not tolerated in the Muslim circles in the late period of Ottoman. Therefore, almost all of the women and children working at the plants were non-Muslims, but also local Muslims did not want to do such jobs. Çağlar Keder explains the socio-economic causes of this situation as follows. So, as a result of land and ownership policy of the Ottoman Empire, villagers were left without land, and the number of villagers left without land was low compared to other places. and labor was cheap, capital was not much, and machines were expensive. Therefore, machines could not substitute human labor, and therefore most of the villagers who did not have land were working as agricultural workers, and they were remaining in the villages and the farms as sharecroppers or workers. In other words, since the Western Anatolia could not produce unemployed people without land, the need for labor, cheap labor in Izmir was covered with the migrant laborers, and this new proletariat mostly came from Greece, and they were removed with compulsory migration and massacres in 1922, and people coming from Italy, France and Malta were left. Celal Bayar published his memories in 1967 and in later years, and he says that in 1913, after the Balkan Wars, there was a compulsory migration campaign against the Greeks living in the Aegean coast, and he also made a meeting with the manager of the tobacco company, and Bayar says that almost all the workers of this company were Greek, and he asked the manager to employ Muslim migrants, and the manager was quite surprised with this request, because until that time Muslims only worked as the clerks in the company. Maybe Bayar does not tell us why he was surprised. So the people that Bayar wanted him to employ was not only Muslims, they were probably also women. So this picture shows us that Bayar was successful in his request. So you see that it was after 1913, but before 1922. Also, in 1927, just like we have seen before, widows were working. The number of widows working in the plants was quite high. So these migrants were, people who migrated were replaced by widow women, and migrants coming from the Anatolia, Central Anatolia, were replacing people who migrated, and we see the influence of the war and compulsory migration in the Western Anatolia as of 1913-14. But the first wave was migrants from the Balkan War, but second larger wave was the Greeks running together with the Greek army during the independence war of Turkey. First, people running away from violence, fire and rape came, and after Izmir was taken back, people who wanted to benefit from the richness of the city came, and the second group was composed of Muslims, but it also had many people who were left without homes. And the journalists of that period believed that the number of people who migrated to Izmir and its periphery was around 1 million. And this corresponds to the internal migration that Ayşe mentioned in her presentation. Of course, we can take into account the population exchange. So I think in Izmir it should be around 100,000. But Harikzede is a special group, and newspapers of that period discusses this group as a separate group. Harikzede, these are the victims of fire, and in the newspapers of that period they are generally referred to as a desperate group which is left by the community. And they were mostly referred as people who damaged from the house crisis. They were homeless, they were not able to afford paying a rent, and they had to leave their villages due to the war. They had to leave their towns because of the war. So this is how we see Harikzede. And now let's talk about bread. So it was discussed widely, particularly in the summer of 1924, and we know how important the bread prices were in the Ottoman Empire. It also happened during the Republican period. And we see that the high level of the bread prices was covered in the reports and newspaper articles in 1924, and journalists started to write about this in the summer of 1924, and they started to criticize these bread prices heavily, high bread prices heavily, and we see that the problem is due to a lack of sufficient wheat growing in the year, and the country had to import wheat. And when we look at the world prices, the prices was quite high until 1928, and Izmir municipality, it was in July 1924. Yes, I forgot a few things. So. And in July 1924, Izmir municipality announced that it would provide subsidy for the producers for the prices increased due to the increasing wheat price in the US. But there was unpleasantness, and we see the articles also indicate that. And for instance, Mehmet Şevki, who was writing for the Ahenk newspaper, in July 1924, the price of bread in Izmir was 8 kuruş more than Istanbul. When bread was 16 kuruş in Istanbul, it was 24 kuruş in Izmir. He says that it was because of the ambitious intermediaries, and he was blaming Izmir municipality for doing nothing, and he ignored the international dimension of the issue. So, I want to skip a paragraph, but this is what I wanted to show. So when you see these prices, when you compare this with the salaries, remuneration, you can understand the dimension of the problem. So you see, people could not earn sufficiently to eat, to buy bread. The salaries were not sufficient. It's quite weird. And in these writings, we see information only about consumption. It's quite interesting. And these poor people are always referred to as consumers to us, always presented us as consumers. And when we look at the remuneration salaries, we see that there are discussions about salaries as well. So the salaries are salary level is not sufficient, and in some articles they say that the public servants cannot live sufficiently with their salaries, but in some small sentence they say that okay, there are some people who earn less than public servants, and Harikse'de are generally presented us as homeless people who need homes, for accommodation. For instance, in Anadolu newspaper, we can hear their voices to a certain extent. For instance, in February, there's a writing about the bread problem, and this bread problem reveals this problem very openly. So people are crying. We are crying to the municipality, to the parliament, and so they are saying, but they are just paying lip service. But unfortunately, they don't take into account people who are hungry. We don't want people to talk. We want people to do something. So we want jobs. So the problem is not price. The problem is the low level of the salaries. And of course, there's also lack of producers here. And the problem is arising from the lack of sufficient production. And journalists never discussed this back then. In the Western Anatolia, wheat was not grown. Generally, there were orchards and fig trees, so they were not growing wheat in the Western Anatolia. But they don't talk about this. but we learned that people who were arriving could not work, but it is very visible that people who left Central Anatolia were not working there, and this caused a decrease in the wheat production. And sometimes it is revealed quite interestingly. For instance, carpet making. So there's an article about carpet making.
This is also dated July 1924. The writer says that the carpet making has improved in Greece very quickly, and there has been a rivalry between these two countries. And now I'm quoting Greeks are trying to enter into the market by replicating our carpets from Sivas, Uşak, Sparta, and Gördes in the European and America markets. Actually, these are the people who are deported from those areas, as if these carpets are being made by ghosts. So, in my writings that I have discussions here, although it is there are referrals to social economical problems, who suffer from the crisis are uncertain. The people with too little resources and workers are almost invisible. So no problems in relation to the production and producers related problems are not discussed. Of course, this is as a result of post-war collapse of the economy and what happened to the non-Muslim actors. This is almost like a phantom pain which could not be identified. Again, Muslims who replaced those non-Muslims were discussed not as producers but consumers. The reason for that is the tension between social classes, which is not appreciated by the government, and also probably the journalists' attitude, negligent attitude towards the poor people, which was there before the war, because there is a prejudice saying that there was a prejudice saying that non-Muslims are rich. If they accept this, this would break that prejudice. Not only the merchant class, but the poor people were also Turkified. Thank you very much.